I have had some people ask me this about Bible translations. Troy, you and I, we use two different Bible translations, and so what I want to do is just real quick, because people ask me all the time about what translation do you use and why do you use it, and I think it would be interesting to go around the room here real quick and just kind of say this is what translation I use and this is why I use it. And so I'll kick us off. I read from the King James Version primarily. Now, I use lots of Bibles in my study, everything from New King James to ESV. I will reference the NIV at times. I have referenced the HCSB, and that's one that I've used recently a lot more as a comparison translation. And then I certainly do a lot of word studies defining the terms. Now, the reasons I choose to use the King James Version, there's several things. Let me say why it's not. It's not because it's the one that the Apostle Paul used. Have you ever heard that old joke?
Yeah, the Apostle Paul using the King James Version.
It came way after the Apostle Paul. There's several things. One, I used it growing up. I memorized a lot of scripture from it whenever I was in school. And so now it's hard for me to preach and teach from another translation, because a lot of times I know certain words and, I can quote verses like Romans 10 earlier. I might not remember the exact verse it's in, but I can start quoting. I can get close to the chapter, and I can start, and I'm looking for those words like walking worthy of the vocation. I can just see it on my page. And so I know how those things are translated. And there are some translation issues in the King James Version, like the word Easter that was completely mistranslated and should have been translated as Passover. I don't think charity to your average person today, they understand what that is in 1 Corinthians 13 and other passages. The places in Scripture where it uses unicorn, the word manifest. But I know these words, I know their definitions, I know why they were translated that way. And when I'm preaching and teaching, I just explain that. Now, I would have to do that with any translation. But the King James Version also memorizes well. And that's why I choose to use it. It's what I know I'm comfortable with. It's a good translation. And while there's other good options out there, it's the one I choose to use.
One of the reasons it memorizes well is because it's written in a song-like cadence. It's written kind of like with that Elizabethan or Shakespearean type language, and so it makes it easier to memorize. I went through school using the King James, all memory verses with the King James, and it did just seem to flow a lot easier. Then whenever I started using my New King James, it didn't flow quite as easy. It's not as easy to quote. So the two versions that I use are the New King James and the New American Standard. I also use the ASV sometimes.
And the American Standard Version, the New American Standard Version are different.
They are very different. So basically the reason that I use the New King James is because it is still part of what's called I call them the Antioch group of manuscripts. That is the Textus Receptus that the King James is based off of. And there's a lot of criticism on the Textus Receptus that is unwarranted, that people like to throw at it, but it's unwarranted criticism because it has a lot of verses in it that are not found in these modern versions. That's why if you read a modern version like the ESV, the NIV, and all these other ones that are out now, you'll have verses that are missing. Let me give you one. Acts 8, verse 37. If you read the NIV, ESV, or any of those, just go to Acts 8:37 right now. You're probably not going to find it because it
actually skips over.
It'll skip over it. And if you're lucky, it'll be a footnote down at the bottom. That drives me crazy.
But it is in the New King James.
It is in the New King James.
I had somebody here one time tell me, and they meant well, but they were like, well, it cuts out verses, New King James.
No,
it actually uses a combination of the manuscripts.
Yeah, the New King James actually adds a few more manuscripts that the King James did not have, which is why I also like the ASV, 1901 ASV.
Mm-hmm.
But then the reason I like the New American Standard, let me back up with why those, not the King James, because you mentioned earlier just kind of archaic language. You know, we don't speak in these and thous, although it's beautiful. We don't speak that way, and so that's why I like quote unquote modern English versions. But the New American Standard is a version based on that other manuscript family, but at least what it does in Acts 8:37 and verses that are missing or questionable. That's a better way of saying questionable verses. It puts it in brackets. Instead of just taking it out, putting it in a footnote, it puts it in brackets. And so that's kind of a flag to me, like, oh, here's a verse that's in question that some of the scholars are wondering if it actually belongs there, or if this was a scribal entry, or if this was maybe a variant from one. And that's really the question. They're called variants.
Well, I like thy choices, and thou didst well. I really had to think about that, how I was going to say it.
I was going to say, to be able to even speak like that,
I can pray that way, but because I brought myself up, but when I was trying to think of a way of saying that, it was a little challenging. And I will say, I find myself, if I have somebody that was not brought up with the Bible, reading the Bible, and I've encountered a lot of people that way, and there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that, it's not because there's something wrong with them. It's just they weren't exposed to it. And I find myself going to New King James, sometimes ESV, but normally New King James, and I'll give them one, and I'll read from the New King James just because I know the these and the thous, the archaic language, is a little challenging.
Listen, there's something really important about the King James that no other English Bible does, and you hit on it when you said thee and thou, and then you use the word like blesseth or whatever. There's different. The way that it writes out the words makes it more specific or closer, I should say, to the Greek. See, the problem is the Greek language does not line up with the English language. It actually lines up closer with the King James, the way the King James was written, than it does any other English.
And that's why it doesn't use the word love in 1 Corinthians 13.
Loveth, yeah.
Well, yeah, as far as like the ongoing action.
Right. That's what I mean.
Yeah, agape. Because it's a deeper meaning than people when they use.
Oh, you can get Troy going. He just preached a sermon about agape love. Anyway, so Jeff, what about you?
King James Version, and I guess maybe based on that's what I grew up using, but that's what I'm comfortable with. And now I do in my studies, I always, especially if I have a help here, I'll have Strong's with it as well.
Now, Strong's, identify that for people.
Well, Strong's Concordance, basically, and you can find this program with My Sword or eSword on a computer program that's free for the download. But you can actually highlight a word that you might have difficulty with. It'll tell you the Greek word for it, and it'll also or Hebrew word, and also give you a definition of it. And that makes it more understandable if it's maybe a word that we don't commonly use today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Livy, a great question. We're going to get right to it here in just a minute as soon as we finish up this part of our discussion. But Ray, what about you?
Let's see. Where's my stuff at?
I caught you off guard, didn't I?
You did. Well, I'm trying to make sure we're working on some stuff in the studio, and I'm trying to make sure nobody walks in front of a camera that I'm using right now. So, as far as the version that I use is the King James version, and for me, it's simple. I was sitting there listening to you guys, and I was like, "That's good. That's why I use it."
Right.
But for me, it's what I grew up using, and so it's simpler to me. Just like you, I memorized verses out of it, not as many as you probably, because I'm not good with memorization. But so I'm used to it, and for me, it's because I understand the problems that are with it. Like you guys are talking, each translation has its own issues, and I know the issues with the King James version, so it's easier for me to use when I'm doing my studying or when I'm teaching somebody else, because I can explain the problems with it better than using a different version that I don't completely understand fully.
Yeah, Marilyn Brantley puts on here, all we have used since I was a small child is KJV. And you're exactly right. And I had and I still have it, but I have a Dixon Study Bible that I loved, and I used it in a lot of, and it was always handy because it put the ASV, when it would differ from the King James, it put it in brackets.
Mm-hmm.
And, I used that growing up, and it was King James, ASV.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to tell you, you know, Bibles can almost turn into things like Ford versus Chevy. You know, I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages of both, and I know I probably just opened a can of worms, but by saying Ford versus Chevy, but you know, these translations do involve men, and that's why it's good to be able to go back to the manuscripts. That's why we teach classes like Greek here and word study courses, and you know, and you got a reference, you know, right now in your hand to kind of show people a Strong's. That's an old one there. You actually, were you looking for the brown version?
That's why I couldn't find it. I was looking in the shelf. So you see all behind us, all these books and everything we have.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I was going to go to was what Jeff was talking about earlier, is
Right.
Strong's Concordance. This is a typical Strong's Concordance.
Right.
They're huge books, but inside of this is what's interesting about it is on the inside is every single Greek and Hebrew word has been numbered.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what you'll see a lot of times if you read any commentaries or anything like that. It'll say G 4295 beside a word that they're talking about. And that means, well, you can go to this book right here or on a program and
Right.
look up that number, and it'll tell you the definition.
Because that's
Right.
actually corresponding for Thayer's as well, because on Thayer's you end up having to have a little bit of Greek knowledge to be able to look up and use the words.
Yeah.
But a lot of Thayer's have actually been numbered to Strong's now,
Uh-huh.
to where you can use a Thayer's because of that Strong's numbering system.
Yeah.
And it comes in really handy because if you don't know what, you know, a sigma, if you don't understand those letters. Now, Jody, you asked a question specifically this, so I'm going to get that. Livia, I'm still getting to you. Hang with us. But is People's New Testament a good study Bible? I've always called it Johnson's Notes. And the answer to that's yes. I used to carry Johnson's Notes with me, and it was the People's Study Bible, New Testament. And it was just where a man has put in notes along with the Bible. And Dixon Study Bible did that. The Thompson Chain Reference is another one that's well known. Nelson has one that they do. I don't endorse the Nelson, but a new one that's out that's actually, and if you go to Chula Vista Books, you can get it there, or Apologetic Press website. They have one that comes from an apologetical view.
Oh, yeah.
A new study Bible. In fact, don't you use one some?
We have several at Margaret Street. It's a great study Bible.
My wife and my boys do. It's done by Apologetics Press. It's a New King James translation, but specifically about the people's New Testament. Yes, it's just realize when you see these helps that's not inspired. Cross references. That's one of the things about Dixon Study Bible you have to be careful about, is a lot of their cross references have a premillennial slant to them. And so you still have to be a little bit careful.
So yeah, the Bible that I use right here, I'm going to be labeled as something bad now, but
Well,
I
don't
use-
tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. No.
I use a Ryrie Study Bible, and he is very much premillennialist. And so in the front of my Bible right there,
I'm going to read it. This is a great layout for a study guide Bible, but Ryrie is a false teacher, premillennialism, in many of his commentary notes.
so I don't want anybody, finding the Bible that the preacher is preaching out of, if it ever gets lost, or, when I pass on and go on to my reward and people want to look at this Bible and go, he used a premillennialist Bible. It's like, no, this is actually a good thing, because I see a lot of what people teach, and some of the false teaching that's in there, and it helps me know how to answer questions.
Right.
And if you ever have a question about, is this a good translation, or are there things that I need to be cautious of, you can reach out to us. Send us an email at questions@haveabiblequestion.com. Don't forget, you can be submitting your question tonight through that email as well.
Can we add just one little thing to that, caveat to that? Pretty much all translations are good. As long as you get a good translation, not a paraphrase, that's the main thing. If you be careful with paraphrases,
And like the message.
yeah,
That's not a
paraphrase.
translation.
It's not a translation. It's a paraphrase.
The Good News for Modern Man.
That's
Did I get
also
that
a
one right?
paraphrase.
That's Living Bible. I
The Living
believe,
Bible.
yeah.
That's not a translation.
No.
We want you to get a translation there. But there are things to watch out for in every one of them. And if you need some help with that, if you find a study Bible, you want to just ask, because like Revised Standard Version, I'm not a big fan of the RSV translation, and that would take longer than I have tonight to go into. But if you have questions about that, let us know. But
you should have more than one translation if you really want to study the Bible.
Yeah, see the different words, and have a Strong's Concordance. Look up words, because the one mistake I will say that some people do is they read it, and then they read this version, and they read this version and say, "Ooh, I like this one better." That's not what we're saying. We're not saying have multiple versions so you can pick which one fits what you want better.
I so jeet.
Yeah. So anyway.
All right.